Welcome to our channel. Tonight, we dive deep into the realm of the unknown with 5 true horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. Turn off the lights, sit back, and let the darkness consume you as we embark on this journey of terror. Story 1. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a cold, rainy night in late October when Jake was driving back from his girlfriend's house. The road was slick with rain, and fog hugged the ground, making visibility nearly impossible. He could barely see the beams of his headlights cutting through the dense mist. Jake was driving along a stretch of highway known for its ghost stories and urban legends. He never put much stock in those tales, but tonight, something felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, broken only by the rhythmic swish of his windshield wipers. As he rounded a sharp bend, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman, drenched from head to toe, shivering under a thin jacket. Without thinking twice, Jake pulled over and rolled down his window. "Do you need a ride?" he asked. The woman nodded, her eyes wide and pleading. "Yes, please, I need to get home." Jake unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in. She was quiet, her clothes dripping water onto the seat. Jake noticed her hands were ice cold, and she seemed almost translucent in the dim light of the car. "Where are you headed?" he asked. She gave him an address that was about 10 miles down the road. As they drove, Jake tried to make small talk, but the woman was reticent, only responding with nods or single words. After a few minutes, she spoke up. "Thank you for stopping. Not many people do." Jake smiled. "No problem. It's not a night to be out walking." They drove in silence for a while until they reached the address she had given him. It was an old, dilapidated house at the end of a long, gravel driveway. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. "Here we are," Jake said, but when he turned to look at his passenger, she was gone. The seat was empty, and there was no sign she had ever been there, except for a small, wet spot on the seat. Confused and a little shaken, Jake got out of the car and walked up to the house. He knocked on the door, and an elderly woman answered. "Can I help you?" she asked. I gave a young woman a ride here," she said. This was her home. The old woman's face went pale. "That must have been my daughter. She died in a car accident on this road 10 years ago." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He apologized and hurried back to his car, his mind racing. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just encountered something otherworldly. Story 2. The Whispering Woods. There's a forest in Northern California that locals call the Whispering Woods. The name comes from the strange, soft whispers that can be heard when the wind blows through the trees. Most people dismiss the stories as mere superstition, but a group of friends decided to investigate. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when Sarah, Mike, Linda, and Jake set out for the woods. Armed with flashlights, camping gear, and a healthy dose of skepticism, they planned to spend the night and see if there was any truth to the whispers. They set up camp in a clearing about a mile into the forest. As night fell, the sounds of the forest came alive: the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The friends sat around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories, until the conversation inevitably turned to the legend of the Whispering Woods. "Do you think we'll hear anything tonight?" Linda asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Mike shrugged. "Who knows? But if we do, it'll make for a great story to tell." As the night grew darker, the friends settled into their tents. Sarah and Linda shared one, while Mike and Jake took the other. The fire slowly died down, and the forest was plunged into darkness. Around midnight, Sarah was jolted awake by a soft whispering sound. She nudged Linda, who was still asleep. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "Listen." The two women held their breath, straining to hear. There it was, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the sound of someone talking just out of earshot. It seemed to come from all around them, carried by the wind. "Maybe it's the wind through the trees," Linda suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Sarah nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. They lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. In the other tent, Mike and Jake were also awake. They had heard the whispers too, and it set them on edge. Mike grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. "I'm gonna check it out," he said. Jake, not wanting to be left alone, followed. They walked a few yards from the campsite, shining their flashlights into the dark woods. The whispering grew louder, but there was no discernible source. "Hello," Mike called out. "Is anyone there?" There was no response, only the constant, eerie whispering. The hair on the back of Jake's neck stood up. "Maybe we should go back," he suggested. Mike nodded, and they retreated to the safety of their tent, but the whispering continued throughout the night, keeping them on edge. When morning finally came, the whispers ceased. The friends packed up their gear and hurried out of the woods, eager to leave the unsettling experience behind. Years later, Sarah came across an old newspaper article about the forest. It detailed a tragic story from the early 1900s when a group of settlers had disappeared in the woods. The locals believed their spirits still lingered, forever whispering their tales of woe to those who dared to enter. Story 3. The Haunted Hotel Room. During a business trip to New Orleans, David found himself staying at an old, historic hotel in the French Quarter. The hotel had a charming, antique feel, with its vintage decor and creaky wooden floors. David was assigned to room 308, a corner room with a beautiful view of the city. After a long day of meetings, David was exhausted and ready to relax. He took a shower, ordered room service, and settled into bed with a book. Around midnight, he turned off the lights and drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, David was awakened by a strange noise. It sounded like the soft rustling of fabric, like someone was moving around in the room. He sat up, squinting into the darkness, but saw nothing. "Must be my imagination," he muttered, lying back down. But the noise persisted. It grew louder, now accompanied by a faint whispering. David's heart began to race. He reached for the bedside lamp, but it wouldn't turn on. The room was plunged in darkness. Panicking, David fumbled for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was no one there. The noise had stopped, and the room was silent once more. The figure moved closer, and David could make out the outline of a woman. She was dressed in a flowing, old-fashioned gown, and her face was obscured by long, dark hair. She reached out a hand towards him, and David felt an icy chill spread through his body. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she vanished into thin air, leaving David alone and terrified. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night, keeping all the lights on and his phone clutched in his hand. The next morning, David went to the front desk and asked to change rooms. The clerk gave him a sympathetic look. "Room 308. She asked ... David nodded ... "You're not the first to have a strange experience in that room. It's said to be haunted by the spirit of a woman who died here many years ago." David didn't need to hear any more. He quickly packed his bags and left the hotel, vowing never to return. Story 4. The Shadow in the Mirror. Emily loved exploring antique shops. There was something about the old, forgotten items that fascinated her. One weekend, she visited a small, out-of-the-way shop she had never been to before. The shop was filled with all sorts of curiosities, but one item caught her eye: a large, ornate mirror with a beautifully carved wooden frame. The mirror was stunning, and Emily knew she had to have it. She negotiated a price with the shop owner and brought it home, placing it in her bedroom. It fit perfectly with her vintage decor, and she was thrilled with her find. That night, as Emily was getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a shadow move across the surface of the mirror. She turned to look, but there was nothing there. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, she went to bed. Over the next few days, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the mirror. She would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in its reflection, but whenever she looked directly at it, there was nothing there. It was always just out of sight, just a shadow at the edge of her vision. One evening, as she was brushing her hair, Emily saw the shadow again. This time, it didn't disappear when she turned to look. Instead, it grew darker, more defined. She could see the outline of a figure standing behind her, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Emily spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned back to the mirror. The shadowy figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emily did some research on the mirror. She discovered that it had once belonged to a wealthy family who had suffered a series of tragic events. The family's youngest daughter had died under mysterious circumstances, and it was said that her spirit was. Emily was skeptical, but the strange occurrences continued. She would hear faint whispers at night, and sometimes, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder when she stood in front of the mirror. It was as if the spirit was trying to communicate with her, to tell her something. One night, Emily decided to confront whatever was haunting the mirror. She lit some candles, sat in front of the mirror, and spoke to the spirit. "Who are you? What do you want?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the mirror began to fog up. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the mirror began to fog up, as if someone was breathing on it from the other side. Slowly, words began to appear on the glass. "Help me." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "How can I help you?" The words on the mirror changed. "Free me." Emily knew she had to do something. She reached out to touch the mirror, and as soon as her fingers made contact with the glass, a powerful force pulled her in. She found herself in a dark, shadowy realm, face to face with the spirit of the young girl. "Please," the girl whispered, "set me free." Emily nodded, determined to help. She reached out to the girl, and as soon as their hands touched, there was a blinding flash of light. Emily was thrown back into her bedroom, the mirror shattered on the floor. The room was silent, the air heavy with the lingering presence of the spirit. But Emily knew that the girl was finally free. The shadow was gone, and the mirror was just a broken piece of glass. Story 5. The Abandoned Asylum. The old asylum on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for decades. It was a place of dark history and whispered rumors. Many said it was haunted by the tormented souls of former patients who had suffered unspeakable horrors within its walls. One Halloween, a group of friends decided to explore the asylum. They had heard the stories and wanted to see if there was any truth to them. Armed with flashlights and a video camera, they made their way to the decrepit building. The asylum loomed in the moonlight, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. The front door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of decay. "Creepy place," Mark said, his voice hushed. "Yeah, no kidding," Jenna replied, shining her flashlight around. "Let's stick together." They moved through the asylum, their footsteps echoing off the tile floors. The walls were lined with old, rusted beds and crumbling medical equipment. It was easy to imagine the screams and cries of the patients who had once been confined here. As they ventured deeper into the building, strange things began to happen. Jenna's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in darkness. Mark's camera picked up faint whispers and ghostly apparitions that the others couldn't see. The temperature dropped suddenly, and they could see their breath in the air. "I don't like this," Sarah said, hugging herself for warmth. "We should leave." But Mark was determined to capture evidence of the paranormal. "Just a little longer," he insisted. "We're so close." They continued their exploration, reaching the basement where the worst of the asylum's horrors were said to have occurred. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and the walls seemed to close in on them. Suddenly, they heard a loud bang, followed by the sound of footsteps. They froze, their flashlights darting around the room. "Who's there?" Mark called out, but there was no response. The footsteps grew louder, and a shadowy figure appeared at the end of the hall. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned hospital clothes, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He moved towards them, his expression twisted in pain and anger. "Run!" Jenna screamed, and they bolted back up the stairs, the figure close behind. They raced through the halls, their hearts pounding in their chests. The asylum seemed to come alive around them, doors slamming shut and walls shifting. It was as if the building itself was trying to trap them. Finally, they burst through the front door and into the night. They didn't stop running until they were far away from the asylum, gasping for breath and shaken to the core. When they reviewed the footage from Mark's camera, they saw the figure clearly, its face contorted in agony. They also heard the whispers, voices begging for help and release. The experience left them with no doubt that the asylum was truly haunted, and they vowed never to return. Story 6. The Silent Call. Jenny had always been a light sleeper. So, when the phone rang in the dead of night, it startled her awake. Gradually, she reached for her cell phone on the bedside table. The screen showed an unknown number. Frowning, she answered the call. "Hello," she said, her voice thick with sleep. There was no response, only silence. She waited a few moments, repeating her greeting, but there was nothing. Irritated, she hung up and tried to go back to sleep. But just as she was drifting off, the phone rang again. This time, she didn't bother checking the number. "Hello," she said, more forcefully. Again, there was silence. Jenny was about to hang up when she heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It sounded like someone trying to speak, but the words were garbled and unclear. "Who is this?" she demanded, a shiver running down her spine. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, but still unintelligible. Frightened, Jenny hung up and turned off her phone. She lay in bed, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what had just happened. The next morning, she told her friend Lisa about the calls. Lisa shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably a prank or a wrong number. But Jenny couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, the phone calls started again. Jenny's phone, which she had turned back on, rang incessantly. Each time she answered, there was the same eerie silence followed by the faint whispering. It was as if someone or something was trying to reach out to her. Desperate for answers, Jenny went to the police. They traced the calls, but they all came from different, untraceable numbers. There was no pattern, no way to stop them. The calls continued for several nights, each one more disturbing than the last. One night, after another series of unsettling calls, Jenny decided to record the whispering. She played the recording over and over, trying to decipher the words. Finally, she made out a single phrase, "Help me." Determined to find the source of the calls, Jenny did some research. She discovered that her phone number had previously belonged to a woman named Margaret who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Margaret's family had reported strange phone calls in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Convinced that Margaret's spirit was reaching out to her, Jenny visited the woman's last known address, an old house on the outskirts of town. The house was abandoned, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. Jenny entered the house, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she explored the decaying rooms, she felt a growing sense of dread. In the basement, she found a small, locked room. With a sense of foreboding, she forced the door open. Inside, she discovered Margaret's remains. The woman had been trapped in the room, unable to escape. Jenny called the police, who confirmed the identity of the body. The phone calls stopped after that night. Jenny felt a sense of relief, knowing that Margaret's spirit was finally at peace. But she couldn't forget the terrifying experience and the eerie whisper that still echoed in her mind. Story 7. The Doll in the Attic. When Claire and her family moved into their new home, they were excited to start fresh. The house was an old Victorian, filled with charm and history. Claire's favorite part was the attic, a large space filled with forgotten treasures and dusty old furniture. One day, while exploring the attic, Claire came across an old, dusty trunk. Curious, she opened it and found a collection of antique dolls. They were beautiful but eerie, with their porcelain faces and glassy eyes. One doll, in particular, caught her eye. It was larger than the others, dressed in a faded blue dress with a delicate lace collar. Claire decided to bring the doll downstairs and display it in her room. Her daughter, Emily, was fascinated by the doll and named her Annabelle. Emily would often play with Annabelle, dressing her up and having tea parties with her. But soon, strange things started happening. Emily would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming that Annabelle was moving. Claire and her husband dismissed it as nightmares or an overactive imagination. However, the incidents grew more frequent and disturbing. One night, Claire heard a noise coming from Emily's room. She rushed in to find her daughter sitting up in bed, staring at Annabelle, who was now on the floor. Emily insisted that she hadn't touched the doll. Claire picked up Annabelle and placed her back on the shelf, but the next morning, the doll was back on the floor, in a different position. Claire started to feel uneasy. She couldn't explain how the doll kept moving. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Claire set up a camera in Emily's room. That night, she reviewed the footage and saw something that chilled her to the bone. The doll's head slowly turned, as if it was looking around the room. It then fell off the shelf and landed on the floor. Claire decided to get rid of Annabelle. She took the doll back to the attic and locked it in the trunk. For a while, Things seemed to return to normal. Emily stopped having nightmares, and the strange occurrences ceased. But one night, Claire heard a noise from the attic. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding, and opened the attic door. The trunk was open, and Annabelle was sitting on top of it, staring at her with those cold, glassy eyes. Terrified, Claire grabbed the doll and threw it in the trash. She hoped that would be the end of it, but the next morning, Annabelle was back in the attic, sitting on the trunk. Desperate, Claire contacted a paranormal investigator. The investigator told her that the doll was possessed by a malevolent spirit and needed to be properly disposed of. They performed a cleansing ritual and took Annabelle far away, to a place where she could never harm anyone again. The house felt lighter after Annabelle was gone, and the strange occurrences stopped. But Claire couldn't forget the doll's eerie presence and the sense of malevolence that had permeated their home. Story 8. The Phantom Roommate. When Lisa moved into her new apartment, she was excited to start a new chapter in her life. The apartment was small but cozy, and she loved the quiet neighborhood. She had found the place through an online ad and moved in without ever meeting the landlord in person. Everything was perfect until strange things started happening. It began with small, almost imperceptible changes. Items would be moved or go missing, only to turn up in odd places. Lisa shrugged it off, attributing it to her busy schedule and forgetfulness. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, Lisa heard a faint noise coming from the living room. It sounded like someone was moving around. She cautiously walked out, but the room was empty. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, all secure. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances grew more frequent and unsettling. Lisa would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, but whenever she checked, there was no one there. She started to feel like she wasn't alone. One night, Lisa decided to stay up and see if she could catch whoever was responsible. She sat in the living room, the lights off, and waited. Around midnight, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps. Her heart pounded as she strained to see in the darkness. Suddenly, the figure of a young woman appeared at the end of the hallway. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing and looked directly at Lisa with sad, hollow eyes. Before Lisa could react, the figure vanished. Terrified, Lisa contacted the landlord and demanded to know if the apartment had any history of hauntings. The landlord reluctantly admitted that a previous tenant, a young woman named Rachel, had died in the apartment under mysterious circumstances. Since then, tenants had reported strange occurrences, but no one had stayed long enough to confirm anything. Lisa was determined to find out more about Rachel. She visited the local library and searched through old newspapers. She discovered that Rachel had been a college student who had mysteriously disappeared one night. Her body was found weeks later in the apartment, but the cause of death was never determined. Lisa decided to conduct her own investigation. She set up cameras around the apartment and tried to communicate with Rachel's spirit. She spoke to the empty room, asking Rachel to show herself, to tell her story. That night, as Lisa reviewed the footage, she saw Rachel's ghostly figure appear on camera. The spirit moved through the apartment, her expression one of sorrow and confusion. Lisa felt a pang of empathy for the lost soul. Determined to help Rachel find peace, Lisa reached out to a local paranormal expert. Together, they performed a cleansing ritual, asking Rachel to move onto the afterlife. As they finished the ritual, the temperature in the room dropped, and a soft whisper filled the air. "Thank you." The disturbances ceased after that night. Lisa never saw Rachel's ghost again, but she felt a sense of peace knowing that the spirit had finally found rest. Story 9. The Cursed Photograph. Jack was an avid collector of antiques. He loved scouring flea markets and estate sales for unique items with history and character. One weekend, he stumbled upon a box of old photographs at a garage sale. The photos were fascinating, capturing moments from the early 1900s. One photograph, in particular, caught his eye. It was a portrait of a young woman standing in front of an old house. There was something haunting about her expression, a mix of sadness and fear. Jack decided to buy the photo. Intrigued by its mysterious aura, he took the photo home and hung it on the wall of his study. That night, as he was working late, he heard a faint knocking sound. He looked around but couldn't find the source. The sound continued, growing louder and more insistent. Jack followed the noise to the study, where he saw the photograph rattling on the wall. Startled, he took it down and examined it closely. There was nothing unusual about the photo, but the knocking continued, now coming from the wall behind it. Determined to find the source, Jack tapped on the wall. To his surprise, it sounded hollow. He decided to investigate further and pried off a section of the paneling. Behind the wall, he discovered a small hidden compartment containing a diary and a locket. The diary belonged to the woman in the photograph, whose name was Eleanor. As Jack read through the pages, he uncovered a tragic story. Eleanor had lived in the house with her abusive husband, who had kept her prisoner in the very room Jack now used as his study. She wrote about her plans to escape, but the diary abruptly ended, leaving her fate unknown. Jack felt a deep sense of sorrow and anger for Eleanor. He realized that her spirit was still trapped in the photograph. Trying to communicate her pain, he decided to help her find peace. Jack contacted a medium who specialized in haunted objects. The medium confirmed that Eleanor's spirit was indeed bound to the photograph. They performed a ritual to release her, asking her to move on to the afterlife. As the ritual concluded, the photograph glowed faintly, and Jack felt a cold breeze pass through the room. The knocking stopped, and the air felt lighter. He knew that Eleanor's spirit was finally free. Jack kept the photograph as a reminder of the encounter. He felt a profound sense of respect for the woman whose story he had uncovered and the haunting connection they had shared. Story 10. The Haunted Cabin. Every summer, Tom and his friends would rent a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was their tradition, a time to relax and unwind away from the city. This year, they found a new cabin, isolated and surrounded by dense forest. It seemed perfect. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a large fireplace and a view of the nearby lake. The first night, they built a fire, cooked dinner, and shared stories and laughter. Everything seemed perfect until the sun went down. As night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over the woods. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, as they sat around the fire, they heard a strange noise coming from outside. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything they had ever heard. They looked at each other, unease creeping in. Tom and his friend Mike decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, they stepped outside and scanned the area. The growling continued, seeming to come from the direction of the lake. As they approached, the noise stopped, and the air grew colder. Suddenly, they saw a figure standing at the edge of the water. It was a man. Dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He looked at them with an expression of pure malice. Terrified, they ran back to the cabin and locked the doors. The growling resumed, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. The others huddled together, trying to make sense of what they had seen. The next morning, they decided to leave the cabin and find out more about its history. They visited the local town and spoke to the elderly owner of a small general store. When they mentioned the cabin, the owner's expression turned grim. He told them that the cabin had a dark past. Decades ago, a man named Samuel had lived there. He was a recluse, feared by the townspeople for his violent temper. One night, a group of locals confronted him, accusing him of theft. In the ensuing struggle, Samuel was killed, his body thrown into the lake. Since then, his restless spirit had haunted the area, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to stay in the cabin. Determined to put an end to the haunting, Tom and his friends performed a cleansing ritual they found online. They gathered around the fireplace, reciting prayers and burning sage. As they did, the air in the cabin grew colder, and the growling intensified. Finally, they felt a sudden rush of cold air, and the growling stopped. The cabin fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. They knew that Samuel's spirit had been laid to rest. The rest of the weekend passed without incident, and they enjoyed their time at the cabin. But they never forgot the terrifying encounter with Samuel's ghost, and the eerie growl that had haunted their nights. Thank you for joining us once again on this journey into the unknown. We hope these true horror stories have chilled you to the bone. Remember, sometimes the scariest things are not the ones we can see, but the ones we cannot. Sweet dreams, if you dare.